Hello and welcome back to another episode of Looking Forward. It's an historic Wednesday today because it is zero cases of community transmission of COVID-19. Only 2 cases are recorded at all, and that was because 2 people came in from overseas. What does this mean? We had tens of thousands of people marching last week when we're supposed to have a lockdown. So what is the state of our pandemic and our lockdown at the moment? That, of course, we'll be talking about. Plus, in the US, we've had big protests continuing, and now it seems they might actually have a very direct public policy point. Defund the police appears to be the watchword for this week, and there might even be something to it. But it could be very good, could be very bad. So we'll talk about that as well. And then we'll also look at an imbroglio at the New York Times where the opinion editor got fired because he had the temerity to actually run an opinion piece that the staff disagreed with. So has campus culture overtaken newspapers in America and indeed in Australia? We'll be looking at that, and also expect our usual books and culture segment where we'll be talking about a great book on the interwar period by Ian Kershaw. Chris Berg will be talking about Space Force with Steve Carell. That's a trigger warning for anyone who doesn't like Steve Carell. And I'll be talking about this book called The Narrow Corridor, State Societies and the Fate of Liberty, with Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson as authors. All that and more. To help me do that is my co-host from RMIT University and adjunct fellow at the IPA, Dr. Chris Berg.
G'day, Cross. G'day, Scott.
He crosses to Chris Berg.
G'day, Scott.
It's across the bear.
We're off to a great start.
And great to have you at a desk in the flesh. I'm looking for Gideon Rozner.
Yeah, face to face, social, responsibly distanced, of course.
Yeah.
But
of course, Director of Policy at the IPA, and I'm Scott Hargreaves, Editor of the IPA Review. I'm always the one that I forget to introduce. I'm the guy with the beard. Very easy. So, first topic, as I say, we're supposed to be in lockdown, but that didn't stop tens of thousands of people marching, Chris.
No, it didn't. So 20,000 people marched in Sydney over the weekend. The Stop All Black Deaths in Custody rally, obviously inspired by the Black Lives Matter movement in the United States. 10,000 people marched in Melbourne. The Sydney march was an authorised public assembly after some very last-minute court battles. The Court of Appeal declared that was a authorised public protest. In Melbourne, it was not, but the organisers will be fined for breaching the directions of the Chief Health Officer, not all of the protesters themselves. And Daniel Andrews had, the Premier of Victoria, had recommended and suggested that people shouldn't go out. The question, though, for you, Gideon, so these are huge numbers. These are really big numbers, certainly for protests in Australia. Is the pandemic over then? Are we all done? Is the virus gone? What's happening?
Well, Chris, I always believe in listening to the experts. So I'll defer to the medical experts on whether the pandemic is over. Arguably, we're starting to see that might not have been as scary as it had first, or the modelling told us that it was, but that is a very, very different discussion. But in a medical sense, who knows? In a political sense, in a cultural sense, well, yes. I mean, people are now marching in the street. I'm sure there is some overlap between the social distance warriors who have been saying stay home, wash your hands, etc., etc. Well, I mean, wash your hands is a pretty reasonable thing to say, I guess. And the social justice warriors who said, no, we have to be out, we have to be saving lives, and therefore we can gather in large spaces. In a regulatory sense, though, of course the pandemic is still going on. We're still under lockdown. These undemocratic, I'm not going to use the D word because it's overused, but heavy-handed, cruel measures are still in place. But the interesting thing is you've seen the political shift. I mean, it's interesting to watch Daniel Andrews. He's always somebody who is as cunning as the proverbial in terms of being a political operator, but he's no longer doing his daily dictatorial press conferences outside in the control room against that purple banner saying stay at home with all the medical experts. He's back out in his high-vis inspecting various infrastructure projects like some sort of tin pot dictator inspecting production quotas at a factory or something. He's trying to move away from this issue because he knows he's on a loser now, but he's stuck with this grotesque regulatory apparatus he's created, and he has to still, and here's the kicker, Here's the kicker. He was asked, he didn't bring it up, obviously, didn't volunteer at the press conference yesterday, but he said, look, I know everybody's frustrated, I'm frustrated, but just think, going to that dinner party or visiting that mate might result in an outbreak. How he can say that with a straight face now, I almost admire how shameless this great villain is.
Well, sometimes, I mean, that's a great data point, Gideon, because politicians are amazing. That the weather vanes, their ability to adapt, and what was the famous quote from I think it was Robespierre? He says, "There go the mob. I must lead them," as he runs to catch up.
I'm their leader. I must follow them. Yeah.
Yeah, and there's no doubt that people are voting with their feet, not just in terms of these protests. I saw GPT Property Trust was briefing its long-suffering investors who are, of course, concerned about what's happening to retail, and they're saying, well, look, it's picking up actually. 90% of our stores are open, and foot traffic in the shopping centres that are controlled by GPT are running at 85% of pre-pandemic levels.
Of course they are. There's nothing else to do.
People are out there.
No, seriously.
Traffic is picking up. I mean, I know you walk to work, but you wouldn't even notice.
No, I know the traffic now. It's actually striking. I driving down Kingsway to my other half's house. In the middle of the pandemic, it was like a ghost town. Now it's basically as it was prior to the pandemic.
But there's 2 points to make here, right? So Scott, you opened the show with the correct observation that on Tuesday we had 0 local transmissions. Okay, so that's fascinating. We've been talking about the pandemic since January. We have substantially beat the pandemic in Australia, if not completely beat the pandemic in Australia, and it's time to roll back those lockdowns. But there is an incredible hypocrisy, which I think is probably worth dwelling on for just a moment, that simultaneously we're being told that there's nothing more virtuous than going out and supporting, stop all black deaths in custody, which is it's a good message.
I've never met anyone in favour of it.
No, and it's a serious thing. And as we discussed last week, the Black Lives Matter and the police abuse, these are serious problems and they are worthy of protests. But we can't be simultaneously told not to go to dinner parties at the same time.
I think it's a bit more nuanced than that, because you said nothing's more worthy than going out. I mean, that's the view of the Instagram world and hashtaggery and all sorts of other silly things. But really, the focus should be on regulators, on policymakers, on people who have inflicted this extremely cruel and probably unnecessary lockdown on us all. Daniel Andrews didn't say it's the most worthy thing you could do, but he did say, well, it's a worthy cause, and look, I wouldn't go and I'm disappointed it happened. That is very different language from, this is not the time to get on the beers, this is not the time to
visit your girlfriend.
To visit correct.
Which was
banned for about
for
24 hours,
yep.
Yeah, correct. But you not
or boyfriend, as the case may be.
Not the time to celebrate Anzac Day. Look, I'm with you. I happen to think that the death of George Floyd was one of the most shocking things to happen in the United States since the murder of Emmett Till. I happen to think that Indigenous incarceration is too high, and more to the point, the disadvantage that is causing it is a desperately needed topic of conversation in this country. And I also happen to think that given, ironically, what we've seen with the police are capable of doing during this lockdown, it is the time to talk about police overreach and police brutality. Maybe, just maybe, we should talk about things like the fact that in New South Wales, the police are still strip-searching 12-year-olds at music festivals. But all that said, we were supposed to be in this... Protests should have been, even I will say mass gatherings should have been banned.
So, that was, thank you for that opening, because this is my point. This is the absurdity that they've taken the lockdown to, as we've always been in the situation of ridiculous impositions on minor social interactions, which the literature indicates is almost infinitesimal risk in terms of transmitting COVID-19. So again, we talked about the fishing ban, all these petty restrictions. So in
the beaches, when people are inherently socially distant.
Yeah. So that's
the golf courses.
The golf courses. All.
What do you think? You play golf in a pack of 50 or something?
And this is and this is how
I wouldn't know.
You lose faith in the legitimacy of things. And just as we now and of course I hate to keep quoting Victoria, but it is the extreme case. They're at it again. They closed the Mornington Pier the other day because too many people were fishing, looking outwards from the pier towards the water where they were hoping the fish would appear. And this is how people lose faith, and they lose faith because of the hypocrisy of waving through to various degrees the marches and not condemning them, not using that language. And what gets lost is we are not saying lift all, go to absolute laissez-faire immediately. Gideon, your video has always been about a stage reduction, careful reduction, maintaining social distancing. And in this case, like I personally do still have problems with mass high-intensity gatherings. Sport, much as I want to get people back into sporting stadiums, it is the shouting, it's the emotion. That's when the spit literally starts to fly.
I'm over that now. Here. I think if you can protest,
the policy from here.
It's a personal view. Bars and dancing.
The correct policy from here, as I see it, is given that we have near zero transmission, you open up the economy. You fully open up the economy with the exception of 100-plus person gatherings, because we know that the way these things transmit and spread, that the hyper dangerous events are the business conferences, are the groups, the times when large numbers of people are together and travel and spread. But what we can't forget is we have done incredibly well at building up capacity, building up the capacity to do contact tracing, building up the capacity. Our hospital system has wards and wards of ICUs ready, still ready for the COVID cases that haven't come. It's time to live with that level of risk.
Well, you just stole you gazumped me, because I was going to say, look, we should go back to first principles and talk about what do we even, and this is where the governments and the national cabinet and all the responses sort of fallen off a bit. Initially, the deal was clear. Look, we just need to let the hospital system start. We only have a few thousand ventilators in the country or whatever it is. Once we get those online, then the hospital systems can hope. Stay home, save lives, protect the hospital system. By all accounts, that has now happened.
They shifted the goalposts.
Well, they've shifted the goalposts, but this is why people are losing faith in this. We don't know what we're fighting for anymore.
And so what you got? It's a question of what hill do you die on? And at the moment, they just want to die on every single hill. So we read in the so they're going to
why not have both?
They're going to die on the hill of fishing, or in Queensland, Anastasia Palaszczuk wants to die on the hill of not letting people fly to Port Douglas, even though there hasn't been a case north of Townsville, I think, ever. I'll stand corrected, but there's certainly infinitesimally small rates of transmission in the north anyway. And now that Victoria has achieved zero community transmission, for how much longer can that absurdity remain? So it's the lack of agility. And now they're even saying that at the National Cabinet meeting, the Health Principles Committee might say, well, because of the tens of thousands of people who were marching, we better just wait a few more weeks to see what happens as a result of that before we start lifting the restrictions. This is madness.
Yeah, this is extreme risk aversion on behalf of the government, which is not doing them any favour and not doing us any favour. It is understandable that you would look at what has happened over the weekend and be concerned, but you also simultaneously have to have some faith in the work that you have done to build up a healthcare system and a contact tracing system that can deal with outbreaks. Because if we shut down our economy anytime there is an outbreak, we are never going to open our borders to the rest of the world. We are never going to be able to get back to the economy we had in 2019.
But more to the point, who will comply with these restrictions now, especially if they extend them? Yeah. Especially if they extend them. No, people will not accept, look, because we've let 10,000 odd people march in the streets and yell into megaphones. We're sorry, we just have to keep this. You have to keep your shop going earlier. Every time a premier nauseatingly has gotten into the control room and did their press conference, they've always started by saying, "Look, we just want to thank everybody. Everybody's doing a wonderful job. We didn't have a choice in it," and I mean that quite literally, because the damn parliaments were suspended and these were made by executive fiat. But more to the point, how are you going to say to people, "Look, everybody's done a really good job. Just because of 10,000 ferals we can't control, we just have..." No, people. There will literally be riots in the street, and I might be one of them.
One of the things
I may be one of them.
I will link to an article in show notes, which Chris, you actually shared like 6 weeks ago. It's from May 10th, the New York Times, which we'll be talking about in a minute. The article's called "How Pandemics End." An infectious outbreak can conclude in more ways than one, historians say. But for whom does it end, and who gets to decide? It was a very prescient article, I think, because we have reached that point now. The point of the article being that it's not a medical thing to say the pandemic's over, we've reached such and such a benchmark. It's when societies eventually get sick of it.
Yeah, it's when citizens and consumers adjust to the risk, and so they may make personal adjustments, or they might just decide that the risk of getting the disease is not as great as the risk of not being able to go out or go to work and so forth. And I think in Australia we're actually a couple of weeks well past that point.
Yep.
Anecdotally as well as empirically, the foot traffic has increased. You can see people much more calm. They're not as concerned when you're walking down the street. Fewer people are sort of moving away from each other. It's quite clear that we're well into that stage. So to one sense, it doesn't really matter what the government does as long as they're not over fining or over prosecuting people. For the most part, the economy is just going to start spinning up again. Now, as we've talked many times on this podcast, that doesn't mean we get back to the riches of 2019. I think there's a massive amount of economic work and reform that has to go through. But I think getting people back into work, getting people comfortable going to restaurants, that's just a time thing. It's not a regulatory thing.
Absolutely. And so closer, coming back to the US, which was the original source of the global push, which has seen the protests here in Australia. A week ago, we had protests which were describing, I guess, expressing frustration, anger, and all sorts of emotions, not just about the death of George Floyd, but those who see institutional racism in America, maybe those who don't, but just wanted to see something done. But now we seem to be coalescing, Chris, around, or those protests seem to be coalescing around something more specific. And I thank them for it, because once you actually get to specific policy proposals, then policy wonks have actually got something to say about it. Because when it was racism, like, how do you end racism?
Systemic racism, yeah, that's right. So I think it is interesting, but we had a really good conversation with Dr. Aaron Lane last week about police reform in the context of the protests. But now they've coalesced around this phrase, defund the police. Now, as far as I can tell, defund the police means both everything and nothing.
Yeah.
There is, in the United States particularly, a very marginal radical view about genuine police abolitionism. So the idea that you can't, you need to shut down the police and replace it not with other police, but with, I'm going to quote an author called Alex Vitale, who's written a book called The End of Policing. Replace it with democratic, public, non-police solutions. Now, that is a radical view. But for most part, this defund the police idea seems to be a synonym for radical reform of police, individual police units, or reinvention of police. It's worth pointing out that the presidential candidate, Joe Biden, has very clearly rejected the defund the police argument. But there is a bipartisan view now. In fact, some people that we're going to talk about later also share this view on the conservative side, that there is some radical reform necessary, at least in the United States, about how these police units function,
or some police units.
Some police units.
I mean, it's a massive country with tremendous variety in its.
And that's a really good point, because there are some states and there's some cities where police work very, very well and really strong community policing, but there are obviously places where that is not the case. Gideon, how do you think about? I mean, so would you defund the police first? But also, how do you think about the police reform question in the US? Take a big glass of water.
Yeah. I've been sitting at home vaping too much time on my hands. Miraculous technology should absolutely be legalised. Now, insofar as the United States, look, as I said, I was shocked at what happened to to George Floyd, I think there is a racial element to it. And we know there is a racial element to it because even Mini Mike Bloomberg admitted in a 2015 sort of unguarded moment that when he was mayor, he sent the police into minority neighbourhoods because that was where the crime is. Now, I don't doubt there is a lot of crime happening in minority neighbourhoods. But when you go after, when you have black weed dealers, for example, being rounded up in black neighbourhoods and there is not a corresponding police action for white weed dealers because there aren't any cops there, then that to me seems like a disproportionate police presence, and that's why there's such a high black incarceration rate among several other reasons. But to go back to the concept of defunding the police, look, it's an easy thing to balk at and say, defund the police, I just want no police, anarchists and everything else. But the more I think about it, look, we pay through the nose for police in Victoria, for example, and I don't think we get the best value for our money. I think they do a good job on a good day, but think about it this way. How many people do you know who've been assaulted or robbed or had a serious crime against their personal property and the police come, they take a report, file it away, and nothing ever happens? How many people do you know who went 4 kilometres over the speed limit on the Eastern Freeway and got the book thrown at them? There is a problem with the emphasis of what police do. In the UK, police have non-crime hate incidents at a time when there are cells grooming young girls for all sorts of reasons which I won't go into. We have 12-year-olds in New South Wales being asked to squat and cough by police officers at music festivals and strip searched. Are we really comfortable with the police going after 12-year-olds at music festivals when we have violent criminals marching around our cities and crime is on the way up?
I take all that, and those are points well made. But what do you do?
Well, this is the difference, though. I think defund the police. It's sort of a cart before the horse thing. I think we need to work out what we want the police to do and what the function of police is in a free society. Is it to go after mostly law-abiding citizens who've committed the occasional infraction, or is it to go after violent offenders? But whatever we decide the police want to do, we cut the cloth accordingly. The police funding should follow the function of the police. It not should be, let's just defund them and work out the rest later.
I think there's two things going on here, and one of them could work and one of them won't work. I'll tell you first the thing that won't work, which is the Manhattan Institute's done tremendous work in America, based in New York, through James Wilson and others. Came up with the broken windows model of policing, essentially, and it's not really about the legislation around law; it's how it's actually policed. And study after study that they've done, comparative across the US, shows that when there's these waves of reaction against the police and the politicians put the pressure on to reduce the presence on the streets, reduce the level of arrests and petty harassment, crime rates go up, homicides go up, and say to the extent that it's an issue with minorities, they especially go up in minority neighbourhoods. Because more black people are shot by other black people in America than by white people, and so on and so forth. So that could be actually disastrous. I mean, this is almost predictive that you would see some of that occurring as a result of this. The politicians will not back the police up to try and maintain a police presence on the streets. The alternative, which is attracting some attention, is when they say defund the police, what they mean is essentially disestablish the existing police force that you have. So this was done in Camden, New Jersey. It was a police force that had a terrible reputation for racial incidents, and actually never actually did anything. They wouldn't work other than 9 to 5. They wouldn't actually attend for property crimes, as you say. Everything was work to rule. They had this collective bargaining agreement about when they wouldn't work, and if anyone complained about the police, the collective bargaining agreement kicked in and stopped them actually being prosecuted.
Sounds like the state of Victoria.
Well, it does. I mean, we have police unions here. Police unions are one of the forces behind this. So in Camden, New Jersey, they actually abolished it. They started again. Greenfield's collective bargaining agreement, much more reverted to a community policing model, and they've seen great results come out of that. If that was the sensible core of some of the proposals that's got some potential.
And this is the frustrating thing, because we know what a good police force actually looks like. We've got decades of evidence about the effectiveness of community-focused policing. You want people on a street to have their interactions with the police not be immediately hostile, and this is obviously what a lot of Black Americans are very concerned about, that they grow up only experiencing hostile relationships. The economist Alex Tabarrok actually had a really interesting piece on his blog Marginal Revolution. He's a George Mason University economist, that makes a really obvious point. Why do we ask the police to do so much? Why do we need the police to do, for instance, traffic stops? Traffic stops, which are tend to be non-threatening from the perspective of the police, but if you're being stopped by the police, they can be seen as highly threatening. Many of the most horrific incidences of police and Black Americans we've seen during traffic stops and so forth, they end up being very hostile when it's just being pulled over for broken taillights or speeding, basically regulatory offences,
or a forged check,
or something basically that you would never see the potential for a violent encounter, and yet they turn violent because the police are trained for the worst case scenario, and they have built up in some places a culture of believing that any situation can turn into the worst case scenario.
And I'm just going to say it. There are bad people on police forces, just like there are bad people in every walk of life. I'm not saying police are all bad. In fact, I think most are probably good. But we don't have limits on government power for good actors. We need to, we need to have a stronger, because at the end of the day, the police do work for us. They work for law-abiding citizens. We need to be clear about what police can and can't do,
we also
and restrain the bad ones.
There's something that's quite interesting coming out of the progressive left in the US at the moment, that are starting to realise that they have too many laws. They actually have too many regulatory restrictions on what people can do. One of the most famous incidents in recent years was a Black American who was killed in the process of enforcing restrictions on the sale of cigarettes, individual packets of cigarettes, or individual cigarettes out of a packet, I should say. We don't want to be enforcing so many petty restrictions at the force of a gun. Now, it's great that the progressive left in the US is picking this up, but this has always been the libertarian argument that any law, any regulation is ultimately with the threat of force, with the threat of violence, and enforced by someone who has a gun. We want fewer rules.
Yeah, I would say too, though, that this is one of the many issues where every day you wake up grateful that you live in Australia. Much as I love America and its freewheeling attitude, we should bring a certain amount of humility to this debate, because it is a very different country. It is a strange and deeply violent country. Its foundations were very different to ours. And the average police officer for approaching the average incident, I think, faces an entirely different risk scenario than what you might in a country like Australia. And our police forces across the country, for all their faults, have not approached anything like the militarisation of the American system. I mean, I still hew to that. The original model of community policing that was established by Sir Robert Peel, I think 1830s, when he created the Bobbies in London, based on his experience in Ireland, it's still a good model. And you always get worried when the police forces order an armoured personnel vehicle, and they say we'll only ever use it for the most extreme riots. And next thing you know, there it is out on the streets when somebody's protesting against a COVID-19 lockdown.
It's a really interesting point, and if you recall Bowling for Columbine, the old Michael Moore documentary about gun violence in the US. It's actually a remarkably honest documentary, because it goes through gun availability and so forth. So it goes through the standard arguments for gun control in the United States, particularly after the Columbine high school massacre. But then it ends with this slightly discordant note because he goes to Canada.
Exactly, yeah.
And he looks around and he sees there's the same amount of gun availability, or the same. You can get guns just as easily, but they don't lock their doors.
Yeah.
And he walks into someone's house and, oh, what are you doing in my house? Well, you didn't lock your door.
Yeah.
And so there is this cultural difference, which is right. And Scott, that's absolutely right. And it's sort of hard to view this from Australia, where we do have a different relationship.
So what you're saying, Berg, is guns don't kill people; people with guns kill people.
Well, yeah, I mean, yes, I think, but you can be more nuanced or subtle about that and point out that
I'm being flippant as usual.
Just there are some issues, and we do, Scott, we do have issues in Australia, and the Indigenous incarceration rate and Indigenous interaction with the police is a real problem, and we should think about that deeply. But for the most part, in most places of Australia, we just don't have that same relationship.
Indeed, and just as an aside, it wasn't what we were going to talk about today, but we do have a problem with an Indigenous incarceration rate, but the figures don't support the notion that Aboriginal deaths in custody occur at any different rate to non-Indigenous deaths in custody, and they occur for all kinds of reasons. And this is a result of good policy over a period of time. I'm not suggesting we be complacent about it, but if people are going to take up issues, as they're right to do, it should be based on some kind of evidence.
We should get Andrew Bushnell in to talk about that. Indeed,
yes. So, and there are many causes of Aboriginal incarceration rates. So, once we've solved that problem, we could probably rest on our laurels for the next 40 years.
Can I do a segue?
Please.
Speaking of before we had the police force, they sent in the troops. This gets us to a New York Times column written by Senator Tom Cotton called "Send in the Troops" that has started a huge kerfuffle, really about intellectual culture in the United States. So the story is this: the New York Times published this piece by Senator Tom Cotton called "Send in the Troops," calling for an overwhelming show of force to disperse, detain, and ultimately deter lawbreakers rather than using the police. He wanted the 86th Airborne or something, or 82nd Airborne, something along those lines, to sort that out. This piece was published in the New York Times and started a massive storm of protest within the New York Times itself, making the argument, as far as we can tell, that to publish this was a direct threat to the Black American staff who worked for the New York Times, and this was wildly irresponsible. One tweet from one New York Times staff member, Ida Bay Wells, said, "I am deeply ashamed that we ran this." The piece was eventually there's a huge, if you look it up now, and it's worth having a look to see what the storm is all about, but the piece now has this huge caveat right up the front explaining why they published it and all that sort of thing. And the editor, the editorial page director who published it, a fellow named James Bennett, has resigned with immediate effect, or we should say he's been resigned.
Poor bloke.
As it is. The New York Times now says the tone of the essay in places is needlessly harsh and falls short of the thoughtful approach that advances debate. Anyway, I'll ask you this as a question, Gideon. What are we supposed to think about the paper of record deciding that a piece by a sitting senator is outside the realm of legitimate debate, or it is actively harmful?
Oh, are we really that surprised? I mean, I'd much rather the New York Times does it than, for example, the ABC, which has basically similar editorial guidelines. They wouldn't put say Fraser Anning on air. Not that I think Fraser Anning has anything particularly interesting or useful to say, but there is, if you look at the ABC editorial guidelines, there is this bizarre idea of balance, and that, yes, we need to understand all views, but that doesn't mean that views that are not helpful to blah, blah, blah should get undue airtime. By undue, they mean any. Now, what is the difference? It's a distinction without a difference. Are we surprised? I think the best contribution was made by Bari Weiss, who had that thread in which she said, "This is why I've been interested in..." She's
a writer at the New York Times.
Correct. And she wrote... And
for the moment.
and I think she coined the term intellectual dark web as well.
Yeah. I think
so she's got an interest in the cross currents of this. And she wrote, look, people think in looking at campus censorship, I've been pursuing a sideshow. No, it's extremely relevant because the same mentality that is giving us cancel culture on campus will eventually escape and take over our major intellectual institutions. She said, what I was thinking, though, it would take a matter of years, not a matter of weeks. But here we are.
It was interesting. Some of the pushback against that tweet from her colleagues at the New York Times was, oh no, it wasn't just the young people who rose up. It was people of all ages. So I'm not sure what's worse.
Yeah.
So she might actually be a little bit wrong to attribute it to cancel culture and a soft-headedness and a fear of being triggered and all those sort of things that Jonathan Haidt talked about in The Coddling of the American Mind. It could actually just be old-fashioned leftism, and as you say, it's a private enterprise. If that's what they want to do, but they do still have this conceit, and the publishing tradition in Australia is the same, that they're a journal of record.
Yeah,
the New York Times says it's the journal of record for America.
Yeah,
and you can't have that conceit and then just say, but we're only going to service one viewpoint, and apart from anything else, it makes for dreadfully dull newspapers. I remember the Age once upon a time in Melbourne, and even more so the Sydney Morning Herald. Even when Fairfax was definitely of the left, I'm going back, say, 20, 30 years, they used to run conservative columnists, and they'd say to the editor, what are you doing that for? And they'd say, oh, because the teachers read it in the staff rooms and they read it out loud to each other and get really fired up.
Yeah.
So
it actually sells newspapers. It makes it interesting.
I've got some personal experience with this, just the old left and the new left in charge of our publications, and without naming any names, there was a time. So I wrote a column for the Sunday Age for
I remember you had
10
some
years.
good stuff. I think I quoted one of your columns in a uni essay I wrote.
Nice.
Which was surprising.
That's the standards of evidence that I expect.
That's how you get a job
Because I
at the
usually write
IPA.
left-wing essays to try to game the system, but one day I was feeling a bit adventurous and wrote.
So I wrote this column for a long time, and the editors obviously were very keen to have me, but there was a lot of pushback from within the newspaper itself, particularly when I'd write something particularly controversial or that went against some nostrum. But my relationship with editors in this space has always been that old left style editor, where they're just as interested in seeing the argument made as well as it can be, so that the reader has a capacity to weigh up their evidence. And it's it's a nice traditional free speech thing. It's the John Stuart Mill. Our ideas are stronger if they're tested against the better ideas of the other side. But that changed, not at the Sunday Age particularly, but that changed within the Australian media sphere, I think, about 10 years ago, when you started to get all these new publications that would quietly but clearly make it known that they weren't going to publish any of those types. They weren't going to publish any of the IPA types in their pages. That was we're not going to give space to the alternative opinions. Well, we might find
a platform.
We
We
don't want to platform them because we know what they think, and they the list of their pro free speech and their pro free markets and all that sort of thing. So that was a really clear change, and you can think through the history of Australian public intellectual life and realise that was really sharp. There was a time when Gerard Henderson was in the pages of Fairfax, not in the pages of the Australian. There was a time when
John Spooner used to do the cartoons for the Age.
And Andrew Bolt used to be on Insiders. I'm old enough to remember that.
There was a time when these venues, these publishers, thought they were the paper of record or the place that you went to see the best of all sides. They might have had a editorial bent. There might have been 10 left-wing columnists and 2 right-wing columnists, but at least there was a enthusiasm for the concept of debate. I think we're well past that. We don't like debate, or at least on the left, we don't want to see alternative views.
I think it's a bit more complicated. I think in these people's minds, nothing has changed. I think they still think they're the paper of record. I still think they think they're having debates. I think the difference is now that we have become so obsessed with no platforming and related phenomena that they really do think that the Tom Cottons of the world are beyond the realm of acceptability, because they literally think that words printed in a newspaper put people in danger, which is, that's their view and everything else. But I really do not. The thing is, when you don't when you don't listen to the views of the other side, they don't understand what the IPA is about. For instance, people who criticise us and refuse to publish us, they don't know what we do. They don't know how we communicate, and they don't particularly know what our ideas are. But the difference is this. On Sky News, for instance, you get clear and present opinion, self-evident, self-confessed, honest opinion. On the ABC, you get the national broadcaster holding it out to be the guardian of truth that is obviously running a skewed agenda. We can debate on what that looks like, but it's obviously biased. I would much rather the honest opinion than people pretending to report facts who are obviously giving a skewed view of a story. And more to the point, so would most other people. And if people are wondering why when Donald Trump says the media are the enemy of the people, his supporters enthusiastically cheer and clap and holler, that is why.
I'm going to contradict myself and give a contrary opinion because I think it is important that isn't the idea of a journal of record, the journal that determines the shape of a national debate, a very anachronistic 20th century idea that there's just the one place where the debate happens. And in fact, what we've got is such a plurality, not just of views, but of publications, that the New York Times and a lot of other organizations should just drop the conceit that they're the place that determines that where the space is of public discourse. And instead, you've got left-wing and right-wing papers. You've got conservative and libertarian magazines. You've got all these different spaces for different views. And in that sense, if the New York Times just said, okay, well, we're not conservative. Yeah. We're not here to advance that agenda. We're here to advance the agenda of progressive left.
No, it's interesting now that you've contradicted yourself. It would be a more honest approach. I do think, though, society would have lost something. I mean, if you do actually believe that through debate we encounter our fellow citizens, we actually encounter opposite ideas, even if it's only so that we can be suitably outraged and get fired up and talk to our friends about this ridiculous thing that we just read in our newspaper. We would have lost something. I think I'd like to see them lose the conceit about being the journal of record, but I still think there's something to be said for almost a duty to represent the other side reasonably honestly. Actually, a little shout out for the Guardian. Guardian Australia, which has been known to perhaps not run opinion pieces by figures on the other side of the fence, but they will actually faithfully report what you've actually said in a story, even if it's to pour scorn on it. That at least is something.
But look, I take a different view because maybe it's a generational thing, but I couldn't care less what the New York Times prints. And I agree with Chris. Actually, a lot of this is being driven by the fragmentation of the media market. If I want right-wing opinion, I don't have to go out and buy The Age or even The Australian or anything else. I can just either find a sort of niche site that caters to my specific views if I'm so inclined, or I can just go on social media and curate my own feed. But you know what? Even the paradoxically, the New York Times types don't even agree on that. It wasn't so long ago that Malcolm Turnbull got up and he said, the real problem these days is, back in the good old days, information was curated and people read The Age or they watched the ABC and all the right information was curated. Now they can go and get information from wherever they want. It's anarchy.
Gideon,
that is the problem here.
It wouldn't be a show with you if Malcolm Turnbull didn't come.
I am to Malcolm Turnbull what Hunter S. Thompson was to Richard Nixon. He's just I need him. I need him.
I'm going to bring in my leather jacket for the next show just to trigger you.
I will make a serious point though, and this may be New York Times specific or potentially Washington Post as well. But a big difference is the reliance that US politics has on those two venues because they have really significant reporting resources.
Yeah.
Now, I suspect that the role that the Australian and the ABC play in the Australian system is quite similar, but the New York Times will continue to be seen by people on both left and right as a critical venue because they just have a lot more journalists.
But less so. They are dealing themselves out of the debate.
They are absolutely dealing themselves out of the debate.
Yeah.
But it is remarkable how reliant so much of American politics is on their journalistic resources.
And then Trump has a point about the Washington
So,
Post.
Chris, would you say that's an argument for public funding of journalistic resources, or is it
Look,
I've
got a fascinating book on this topic. I don't know whether you've
I heard of it.
Yeah. But this
Heard mixed things.
But Trump's right about the Washington Post. It's now owned by Jeff Bezos, the planet's first or second richest man, and it doesn't have to make money anymore. So, what does it mean for that mission if Jeff Bezos basically gives the Washington Post a blank check essentially to push what he thinks is a good agenda? I mean,
but that's true. I mean, we can go into the history of
what's
history of the media.
What's wrong with
but that's the traditional media, right? So the traditional media before the mid 20th century was partisan, was tend to be non-profit. It would be funded by political parties or donations or what have you. Lots of different ways. The idea that there is a journal of record that is perfectly objective, that is the single space in which you get all the truth from. You subscribe to one of them, and you assume that if it's in the paper, it must be true. That is a weird 1950s.
But also,
I don't think so.
It's fictitious. There's no such. I mean, what are we talking about? We even if we accept the New York Times as a journal of record, we have to accept it as some sort of bias. I think any publication holding itself out to be completely objective is lying. True objectivity is impossible. You can try to take different, balance and here counterpoints and everything else, and be honest, have journalistic standards and everything else, but ultimately it is impossible to cover the breadth of the entire issue in any publication. So I think we actually have to accept bias exists and have to say, look, The Age is a left-wing publication. They publish me sometimes, and good on them for doing that. But you meet people where they are. I think we need to be honest in these sort of discussions.
No, I think we've lost something, and I don't accept that characterisation of the history of newspaper publishing in Australia.
And Jeff Bezos isn't the only one to operate with that
because they had
model.
revenue from advertising. It wasn't. Very few proprietors have the opportunity just to sink buckets of money into newspapers to pursue a personal agenda. I mean, the Guardian is able to do it because it has a trust.
I was going to bring up the Guardian, but the Guardian isn't poor
which
for
they're depleting.
I think among the left of centre publications, the Guardian is one of the best ones. I disagree with them on almost everything, but the quality of writing, the coverage, the resources they have, and they're funded by private trust. We're getting really into the media, the business model of media, and that perennial issue which we've been over and over and over again. But I'm a bit old fashioned in that way. The plurality of voices, the clash of opinions over time, the intellectual free for all.
I'll tell you what. How about we agree to disagree?
Yeah,
conflicting opinions. There's a concept. What a wild concept. We have come to that part of the show where we talk about our books and culture picks. And this week, a rare opportunity in the pandemic, we've actually got more books than we do Netflix series. We have slipped a bit.
Shall I start with the Netflix series then?
If you like.
I can talk about the South Park marathon I watched over Labor Day if you want.
So I watch Netflix because it's actually, when you're not training to work and you're not traveling as I used to do, it's actually not that easy to find time to read, especially when you've got young children. But they're back at school now, so that's a win. So I've been watching Space Force, the new satirical comedy on Netflix, starring Steve Carell and John Malkovich. A quote, ripped out of the headlines satire about the Trump administration. Now, most people who are listening to Looking Forward no doubt hear that description and would think, oh my God, there's nothing possibly worse.
You're describing me at the moment. Yep.
It actually drops a lot of the, quote, satire of the Trump administration after the first episode, which in fact is a shame because the funniest lines are when they're making jokes about tweeting and all that sort of thing. It's not a bad effort. It's the sort of thing that could have gone through a few more script edits because the good jokes decline over time. A lot of these shows, they tend to they throw all the best material in the pilot or the first episode. They get it funded, and then they're like, oh God, we've got to write another 10 episodes. Yeah. It fills in the hours before death. I'll put it that way.
A ringing endorsement.
That's always good. Yeah. So move over Siskel and Ebert. That's your 2 thumbs up.
Well, I showed it to my family and my parents actually, because we spent the weekend with my parents and they just didn't like it at all. So
Steve Carell playing Steve Carell.
Steve Carell playing Steve Carell. John Malkovich is good value though.
Oh, I love John Malkovich. Malkovich being one of my all-time faves. Well, why don't we go from around the table? My book is The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies and the Fate of Liberty by Daron Acemoglu and James A. Robinson, who are famous for being the authors of Why Nations Fail.
And I believe that you are nailing the pronunciation of his last name, Acemoglu.
Very good. Yesterday I was saying Acemoglu, so I'll tell that story against myself, but I'm eventually getting there.
Sounds like someone needs cultural sensitivity training.
Anyway, these are brainy bastards. Daron Acemoglu is Professor of Economics at MIT, winner of the John Bates Clark Medal. James A. Robinson is an economist and political scientist, and he's at the Harris School for Public Policy at the University of Chicago. And this is a terrific book, which I haven't finished yet, but I promise to. And essentially what they're saying is that the countries that thrive, the states that survive, first of all, you do need state formation. You believe in liberty, but you can't be an anarchist. You can't be a libertarian anarchist. You actually do need a state to do things, and it's probably not even a minimal state. It probably goes beyond the basics of keeping order and allowing a place for contract disputes to be adjudicated. There are certain things.
Yeah, the army.
Do we need the army because you
That's
have
it.
to defend your borders? No, they go a little bit
Their
beyond
argument
that.
is against that.
Yeah. So it's legitimate to talk about things like education and health because they are conducive towards prosperity and ultimately liberty.
Sure, but I put that in the bucket of, sorry to cut you off, but I put that in the bucket of the safety net for the most vulnerable. They're basically essential services.
No, I think they're going on. I'm telling you the ground they've staked out. They're tests.
Sorry, I'm
They're
jumping
tests.
the gun.
It's a lock-in defence of liberty, a little bit extended through a sort of I think it's called Civic Libertarianism or Civic Republicanism theory of a guy called Philip Pettit, which is, and it's also about non-dominance. So it's an expansive definition of liberty and freedom. So this is like the end state that states should aspire to. But what it requires, of course, for a state to do all these things is to have trust from the people, and the people rightly don't trust governments. So the only time people will allow governments to do things is when they feel that they still have some power over the state, and it creates this tension, this dance, if you like, and you can see it in the development of states. Kings versus parliaments, and then Magna Carta was the nobles, and then in a democratic era it's the people themselves. It's being able to go into the streets and protest, if you like. And what happens is the states can fail in two ways. They can either fail because the state takes that power, but there's no countervailing force, and they just become despotic. And this is China. They just call it out. It's like, e.g. China. Or it can fail in the other way, which is Congo. It's just the Democratic Republic of the Congo. It's just anarchy. There's no state formation because the people just will not give anyone any trust whatsoever. And this could be because of cultural norms, or it could be just a bad experience.
It's fascinating to think about this right now in the context of a pandemic, where, and we may have had this discussion before on the podcast, but where state capacity turns out to be both really vital and vastly different even amongst wealthy, developed nations. Australia has been demonstrated to have extraordinary state capacity, and that's not that it's a particularly big state or a particularly small state or even a liberty-respecting one, but a state and a administrative function that can quickly do substantial tasks like spin up contact tracing, spin up hospitals and that sort of thing. And then other countries that are actually wealthier than we are, like the United States, clearly have such political or bureaucratic dysfunction that they are unable to do that sort of thing, whether that's for they have higher taxes in many places that have been worse off than Australia, and more wealth, but they've been unable to do what we have done. The Scandinavian countries,
even the UK has messed a lot of things up. They just seem incapable of doing so.
They've been one of the worst.
Scandinavian countries have been incredibly successful, regardless of which approach they take. So Sweden's approach and the Norwegian approach have actually both been very, very successful at at navigating these challenges. Some of the Northern European countries have been incredibly successful. Germany's been incredibly successful. These are high state capacity ones, and part of it is precisely that. It's trust. The trust that the citizens have and the belief that the citizens have that they will adopt changed behaviours and even follow new rules that the government might put in. And so when, to bring it back to the conversation we had to start, this is precisely what Daniel Andrews, what Scott Morrison, what Anastasia Palaszczuk, this is what our leaders have to be thinking about now. Do not squander the good faith by which we approach this crisis. Maintain that state capacity. You can turn off the economy quickly. You've got to turn it back on really quickly too.
Absolutely. And this is a book that I'll be returning to in the future and in the pages of the IPA review. I think it's a very important book for this whole theme of state capacity libertarianism. And it's also got something in there for those who are concerned about China, because the thesis that some Sinophiles put out there is, well, yes, democracy is great, but gee, those Chinese get stuff done. And we used to hear the same thing during the Cold War. It's like, oh, well, the Russians, they get things done.
They used to say the same thing about the Third Reich.
Exactly. Oh, yeah, so all terrible. They get things done, but in fact,
the trains run on time.
But in fact,
that was Mussolini's Italy.
Again, the conclusion of this book is no, they don't. Because in the absence of pressure from the people and any sort of checks and balances which direct the state towards good ends, all the control over resource disposition falls to a despotic state, and it starts to go into... it certainly, first of all, goes into things that are restrictive of liberty, and then it just goes into things that are unproductive. And we're starting to see this, and it definitely happened in Russia, happened in China, and indeed it did happen in the Third Reich. I mean, the Germans, of course, are famously efficient at doing things, working towards an objective, but deciding between the objectives, it was a completely dysfunctional state, thank God.
Yeah.
That China line is important because you hear that so much from business class travellers who visit China and see the airports, which are amazing.
Yeah. And the damn trains.
And all look like...
But they stole the designs off the Japanese. So
like these airports that look like spaceships. But if you get out of the airports, if you get out of the hotels, if you just wander around, you can see, well, it's not all airports.
No, it isn't. Well, it segues nicely into the book I've been reading, which concerns itself in part with the failure of new liberal democratic states which didn't have a strong tradition of democracy, which is a book called To Hell and Back by Ian Kershaw. It's a book about the two world wars and, more importantly, the period in between and the period just after the Second World War, but I'm not up to that part yet. But the reason I wanted to read this book is because, it's such a volatile time, and the point has been made to me on a few occasions. This is liberal democracy and social democracy are really being squeezed here. We're reaching the interwar period where you're either a nationalist or a socialist. You weren't anything in between. So I wanted to read about this, the basics, obviously. But I have to say, when you look at what's happening now, the belligerence of China, major world actor, keen on, reasserting itself in the global order. When you look at New York, with Antifa, a sort of paramilitary group marching around as the state withdraws. When you look at the complex web of tensions and ethnic, nationalist, political, ideological, religious. I mean, where it doesn't bode well.
Well, these are certainly the things to watch for.
Yeah.
I mean, so in the Weimar Republic, everyone remembers the brown shirts.
Yeah.
The Nazi thugs, but the communists had them as well.
Well,
it's just that the Nazis were even more ruthless.
But think about it this way, Scott. How long will it be with Antifa marching around burning down property before there are citizen safety groups that become right-wing militias springing up? Not that I want that to happen, but
no.
if your business is being threatened and the police aren't doing anything, what do? You go and join a...
Well, according to Andy, no, there's already... Antifa's already claimed an area of Seattle with a couple of block radius that the police aren't allowed into, and they're now saying we are responsible for public order. It's like that bloody Batman movie with the guy, that guy.
The guy, yeah.
Him.
Dane.
Ian,
Dane.
so your book sounds excellent. Ian Kershaw is Professor of Modern History at the University of Sheffield, or at least was when I purchased this book, which is his biography of Hitler, which I also recommend because it tells that story about the dysfunctional Nazi state. But you don't want to get there. You don't want to have to find out about what that kind of dysfunction looks like.
Well, no, and this is just a symptom of the fragmentation and the we've lost. I mean, this is the end point of identity politics, I guess. We've divided ourselves up so much. It was only a matter of time before we started to take up arms and literally fight each other,
although
warring tribes.
In fairness, when the looters took over, as they did in so many American cities, what we actually saw was not the Boogaloo boys out there, but they were often heavily armed black people defending their stores against often very, very pasty, white-looking guys who were trying to loot their bloody stores.
Yeah.
So
to conclude, we do need police.
Yeah, these are...
I don't know. I think why fight it? I think us libertarians should just stake out some territory somewhere, out of Melbourne and claim that.
No. First,
I want a piece of this action.
As we discussed last week, first duty of the state is to maintain order. Perhaps that's what...
I don't think we agreed on that, but go on.
As I agreed with myself last week, that is the first duty of the state to defend your territorial boundaries and maintain order, because otherwise there's no damn point. So, good book anyway. What was the name of it again?
To Hell and Back. Europe 1914 to 1949.
And also recommend to you Babylon Berlin, the series set in the age of the Weimar Republic, the most expensive television program ever produced in Germany by Netflix.
Is that right?
It's all subtitled, but it's terrific.
Another one to watch is that old miniseries that was on a while ago, Hitler: The Rise of Evil, which basically is Hitler from when he was born until he became Führer.
Dramatized.
Yeah. It's a miniseries.
Yeah. Okay.
And it goes for about 3 hours. I rewatched it, on this similar theme a few weeks ago. And, you might not think that the young Hitler is a particularly tasteful choice for a movie, the making of Hitler, the coming of age. But it was interesting to see, according to the film, how he became radicalised, how he took over the National Socialist Party or whatever it was back then, how he,
whereas, of course, there's that other show going around at the moment on Trotsky, where they make it's a Russian-made program. They make Trotsky out to be, an evil revolutionary.
No way, really?
Yeah. But that's because Lenin and Stalin are the good guys.
That is so funny. And where was this made?
Just recently. I was talking to someone about
Russia,
it on the weekend. I'll find out what that shows. I actually saw an episode of it. And they were equivocal about Trotsky, but they're rehashing all of the arguments from the 1920s when he got on the wrong side of Lenin and Stalin.
Oh, well, good to see the pro-Stalin view is still.
We believe in balance, don't we?
We do believe in balance.
Thanks to
It should be published in the New York Times.
The New York Times, correct.
No, we can thank Putin for that. Expect to see more of that in the US election. Anyway, thank you very much. Some excellent culture picks there. 2 books, as I actually mentioned, versus only one Netflix program. This has been a great show. Thanks to you, Gideon Rozner.
My pleasure,
and thanks to you, Chris Berg.
Thanks, Scott.
Thanks to Josh in the studio. You've been listening to Looking Forward, which, don't forget, is a product of the Institute of Public Affairs. So if you want to support our programming, not just this one, but all our other great podcasts, support our research, please go to ipa.org.au and get around to see how you can join or donate. We're in the middle of our end of financial year appeal at the moment, and we really have appreciated the people who are suffering through this pandemic but still want to see a voice for freedom operating in Australia. We'll be back with more Looking Forward next week.